So good morning, Masterclass. Today's lesson is going to be on the second half of First Corinthians. And then next week's lesson is going to be on Second Corinthians. And we're using the videos from eyewitnessbible.org or Eyewitness Bible Series if you have the app. So hopefully you've already had the chance to look at the video and the study guide on that. So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite novels that I've ever read. It's by Wallace Stegner, and the name of the book is Angle of Repose. And if we were together, I would ask everybody to tell me if they know what angle of repose means, but you're off the hook today because we're not in a class where we're all together. But the title of the book comes from the fact that his grandfather in the novel was a mining engineer back in the 1800s. And in the mines, as you know, they will take a lot of ore, get the precious metals out, and then they have a whole lot of waste, probably in many cases, 99% of it's waste material. And they pile that in a heap over to the side, and they just keep piling it, and it gets higher and higher. So what happens in the end is you have a cone-shaped pile of material. Think about if you had a handful of sand and you just dropped it slowly, it would make a cone. So depending on what the shape of the particles are, what the particles are made of, the roughness of them, how wet they are, that depends on what the angle of the cone is. And that's called the angle of repose. So some angles on a slag heap would be about like that. Some would be more like this, some like this. And it was very important to know the angle of repose, because if you're right at the angle of repose and you add just one more grain of sand, it'll cause a landslide. So the angle of repose is the exact place where you will get a slump or a landslide off of that. And he uses that as a figure of speech to talk about our lives. And we have other sayings like the straw that broke the camel's back. Or we shorten that sometimes to just, that's the last straw, which means if you had a camel and you just kept loading it with straw, it would reach a point where just one more infinitesimal amount of weight is what breaks the camel down. And I think our lives are a little bit like that sometimes. And I think about it in this time of stress. I think in the Corinthians, what Paul is talking about sometimes is you can just pile so much on and eventually you reach the breaking point. So as we go through First Corinthians today and we go through the rest of this COVID-19 period, I think it's important to always think of things that you can do to not be near your angle of repose, not be on the edge. I know I'm looking at on my screen, I get to see Jamie Sweeney, and I know Jamie and my wife, they like to live on the edge. They like to be right there, say the right cutesy thing, do the right stuff to live on the edge. But this is a time to move away from the edge. This is a time to get away, because you don't want to have a landslide in your life. So when we go through for the rest of First Corinthians, we'll be talking about some verses that where I think in some respects that's what Paul's talking about. So last week, I'm going to set the stage for First Corinthians again. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but last week we talked about the fact that Paul went on the first missionary journey in about 48. He went on the second missionary journey, and in about the spring of 51 AD, again, the spring of 51 AD is when Paul reached Corinth on the second missionary journey. And if you remember from our Acts study, one of the things that happened when Paul was on the second missionary journey was he met Priscilla and Aquila, and he worked with them. They were all tent makers or leather workers. They also had an event late in the time when Paul was there that the leaders of the synagogue took Paul in front of the Romans to try to get him to quit teaching about Jesus. And the Roman official there threw the case out of court. The Jews got so mad at their leader that they beat him, and that was Sosthenes. There was also a different leader in the synagogue earlier in Paul's visit there, but Sosthenes was the one that got beat. So that's in the summer 51 when he gets there. It's September 52, over almost a year and a half, that Paul is in Corinth. It's in the summer of 52 when he leaves Corinth and ends the second missionary journey. And he takes with him at least Aquila and Priscilla. And he probably takes Sosthenes with him. Probably by that time, Sosthenes has converted to be a Christian. And on the finish of the second missionary journey, Paul drops them in Ephesus. Paul doesn't stay in Ephesus for very long, but he keeps moving and goes to Jerusalem. Then in the third missionary journey, it's about it starts in 53, but Paul's in Ephesus almost 3 years on the second missionary journey. And that's where he writes the book of 1 Corinthians. So in the spring of 56, he writes approximately 1 Corinthians. So he in Ephesus has got Priscilla and Aquila. He's also got Sosthenes, probably has Timothy with him. And he has known the Corinthians now for 5 years. Probably has written many letters. He's sent people back and forth, it looks like, or people have gone back and forth. So when he's writing this book of 1 Corinthians, and next week when we do 2 Corinthians, this isn't a matter of he just kind of knows these people or he's heard about them. This is a matter he really, really knows the Corinthians. And when he talks about certain sins, he's probably not pulling those out of the air. They probably can relate to some of those sins. So that's the setup for the writing of 1 Corinthians. And then last week we did the first part of 1 Corinthians. This week we're going to do the second part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute everybody. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to mute everybody. If you want to say something, unmute yourself and do a comment. But we're going to go. I'm just going to start going through various Bible verses. Whoops. Now I'm going to have to confess something. I'm doing this on my phone. And when Mitch gave his lecture today, he said something about in Greek. And I went to the Greek Bible. So now I've got to figure out how to get away from the Greek Bible on my phone. So that wasn't very smart. And it didn't work, by the way. I had to go to my Greek interlinear, which I talked about last week. That's really handy to use. So now I'm in English. We're going to go to 1 Corinthians. You know, the nice thing about these is now with the electronic Bibles, you don't even have to know what order the books are in, Jamie. You can just look at it on the index. So I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians and I'm going to start, since we don't have enough time to do all of them, I'm going to start in 1 Corinthians 8. So in 1 Corinthians 8, one of my favorite verses there that we use, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. And I think for those of us who like to study the Bible, that's something we have to keep in mind, is that knowing everything there is to know about the Bible is not always that awesome. It's important that we love. And the importance of that, I think, is in verse 3, the one little line that is really powerful. But whoever loves God is known by God. I just think that's a very, very powerful verse. So we're going to drop down to 1 Corinthians 8:9. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. And dropping down to 13. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again so that I will not cause them to fall. I know back in Cornerstone class, we had a really nice section on this that Ken Kinnear taught about how important it is for us as Christians that we don't always exercise our rights. It's more important that we are worried about the cause of Christ. And sometimes in the past, we've been much more worried about being right. And certainly in our society today, it's much more important to be able to exercise all your rights, and even more than all your rights. We all want that because we're self-centered. So this chapter, I think, is very applicable to today's times, that it's important for us not to follow the world's example of wanting to exercise every right we have and extend our rights. It's more important that we live like servants. So I'm gonna stop there for a minute. Does anybody have any comments that they want to make about that particular topic and how it relates to what's going on now or your past? If you want to say something, just unmute and go for it. And Grant, I see you raised your hand. Not everybody knows how to do it. So I'm going to let you you don't have to raise your hand. Just open your mic and go for it. And by the way, Grant, we're thrilled that you guys joined the church today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Been very welcoming. Love this church, so I want you all to know that. Hey, Phil, I was just going to say about 1 Corinthians 8. This was the early part of the chapter is really a game changer for me. When I started to realize the section where it talks about how we know that there is one God, and Paul does this little Shema thing, the Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one," and he kind of sets within this a Christological Shema, so to speak.
Right.
But without going too theologically deep here this morning, just this basic thing. There were those who did not understand that there was only one God. And he's not talking about people of the world. He's talking about people within the church at Corinth. And that's why he gets to the point of the practical side of it was, if I need to, I'll stop eating meat so that it would not cause a brother or sister to stumble. And so I think when I realized the level to which some of the early Corinthian believers were still wrapped up in their understanding of a world of many gods still, and yet had, in some sense, had become Christian, I realized that we're too fast at times to draw hard lines of strong fellowship and things like that, rather than to be loving and kind, and realize there are some who are weak. They are referred to as being weak in the faith, but the ones of us who are strong are actually supposed to take the higher level of love and see them through that over time and help them to grow. So anyway, I'll stop there. But 1 Corinthians 8 is just a game changer for me. So
good. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and I think it's along that lines, as we've talked about Corinth in the past. Remember that it was made, the Corinthian church was made up of some Jews, but probably mostly Romans and Greeks and other races of people who did not have a background of one God. They wouldn't have thought about one God. Most of them were used to having many, many gods. And in fact, if you go to Corinth today, I showed a picture of it last week on Google. Still, some of the large temples are in Corinth, still standing. That's what you see when you drive up as one of the big temples. So you would have very likely had the situation where the Christians were worshiping almost in the shadow of all of these gods, and it would have been hard for them to give it up. They could have kind of theoretically been getting there, but it would have been hard for them to walk away. So I think you're right, and it is, when we see this meat, it wasn't just having to do with the sacrifice of idols. These people were really struggling with the fact of the many gods. They just had not yet been able to accept that there is only one God. They were struggling with it. Yeah, it's a good point, Grant. Anything else from anybody? All right, we're going to pop on down to chapter 9 then. We have talked about in the past that one of the biggest problems Paul had was false teachers, and that the false teachers usually represented that they had a lot of authority and that they had as much authority as Paul. So back to chapter 9, a lot of what Paul is doing here, he's not only trying to convince just the Corinthians that he has authority, he wants them to understand that he has more authority than the false teachers and that they should listen to him. So he starts laying out the fact that he is an apostle. And then I think it's the verse 5 is really interesting. Verse 5 and 6, you can impute some things there that aren't obvious everywhere else. So he says, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? So if you stop there, you probably get the understanding that we already know all of the apostles have mostly left Jerusalem and gone out and started evangelizing elsewhere. But now you can really make the case with this one sentence that most of the apostles were probably married and that they were taking their wives along with them on their evangelistic trips. And we often don't think about the apostles being married. We know Peter was. So anybody remember how we know Peter was from the Gospels? Jamie, I see you're shaking your head. How do you know from the Gospels?
Well, he had to heal his mother-in-law.
Jesus had to heal Peter's mother-in-law. That's right. Good. And that was in Capernaum. Yep, good. And then he has a line that's really important to me. He says, or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? If you remember, at the start of the second missionary journey, which would have been spring of 50, so we're 6 years after that, Paul and Barnabas had a sharp misunderstanding, and they split ways. So 5 years ago, Barnabas and Paul split ways, and Barnabas takes John Mark and goes his way. They go to Cyprus, where Paul starts a second missionary journey with Silas. I'm almost positive that this is the only other mention of Barnabas after that point. And I've always wondered if Paul and Barnabas ever made up, where face to face, or whether they made up through letters, or where they always just kind of had a strained relationship, or what. But this one sentence gives me a lot of hope that I think Paul at least had a lot of respect for Barnabas still, and recognized him as an equal, and that was really, really important. And then we know that John Mark is with Barnabas and then later ends up with Paul. So I think that also, I can only imagine John Mark saying good things on Barnabas's behalf to Paul, and good things about Paul to Barnabas. So in my mind, this gives me a lot of hope that Paul and Barnabas were not only on the same team all the time, but they did get along. So let's go down to verse 11. In verses 11 and 12, Paul's talking about, do they have the right to ask support from the Corinthians? And do they not? So some of these verses have been used in the past in some churches to say either that preachers should be paid a lot, medium amount, and some people take some of these verses and get to where preachers shouldn't be paid at all. And I think it's interesting that Paul ends up on the right, that saying it's a right, really, that preachers are supported by their constituents, but he did not use that right on the Corinthians. And it appears while he was in Corinth for that year and a half that he lived on his own work while he was a tent maker, but he also got support coming from Thessalonica and maybe some other places. So it's very possible that Paul lived among the Corinthians and never asked them for support at all. And I think he uses that here to say, you know, that I'm not trying to take advantage of you. These things I'm telling you are out of love, not because I'm trying to get your money. So I'm gonna stop there and let's see if anybody has anything they want to say about that point. Okay, then I'm going to drop down to 1 Corinthians 9:19. And I won't read the whole verse, but I'll read 19 and 22. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And I think that's the strongest word play that Paul could use at all. We've talked about before in some past lessons how the New Testament often translates the word slave as servant, but almost all the time when you see servant in the New Testament, it should be slave. And as many as 30 to 40% of the Roman population was made up of slaves. It was an everyday part of their lives. Slaves had zero rights. Their masters had the power of life and death over them, had total, complete power over them. So what Paul's saying is that he has made himself, he's voluntarily given up all of his rights to let people take advantage of him, just for the sole purpose of being able to win people to Christ and for the sake of the gospel. And that, especially as compared to today's society, that's a very, very powerful thing to do. And I think as we're trying to differentiate ourselves from other people and for the cause of Christ, that's one of the things that we can do, is just make sure we're always have the gospel in mind as being what's important, not our personal rights. So again, I'll pause if anybody wants to say anything there.
Hey, Phil.
Yep.
Can you hear me? It's Grant.
Yes, I can. Yeah, Grant, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to share. Martin Luther once said, kind of this idea: a Christian is perfectly free, that is Lord of all, but subject to none. But a Christian is also perfectly dutiful, a servant of all, and subject to all. So he does that as Luther saw Paul's writings here. He saw we are free, but then again we make ourselves, because of our love for others, we make ourselves a slave to all, a servant to all. Yep. So that's it.
Yeah, and the point there is not that we're a doormat that we let people run over us, but we are to be serving them, and in some ways, sometimes serving for their best interest may not necessarily mean doing exactly what people want us to do. Our point is to serve and be a benefit to them for Christ, not just to not to be doing whatever they want. So I think that's a misunderstanding our kids get sometimes too.
Phil, this is Lyle. Can you hear me?
So down into 10, I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 10:13.
Hey Phil, somebody was trying to comment. I can hear them. Could you hear them?
No, Lisa, is that you?
Yeah, it's Lyle.
Okay, hi, Lyle.
It's in the Western culture, it's very difficult for us to see ourselves as purchased as a purchased possession of Christ. We've been purchased as a slave, and that's just foreign to the Western culture.
Yep. Yeah, we don't like that idea at all. And it harkens back actually to the Old Testament example where it talks about if you're a slave, you free a slave, but he wants to stay with you, he has to you put a awl mark through his ear, but the condition on that is that the slave, it's not that he wants to stay a slave, because that could just be so he could be taken care of, but it's a slave that wants to stay a slave because he loves the master. And I think that's the point. We are to be voluntary slaves because we love the master, not because we have to. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out that you can endure it. So I like those words, but I'm not sure I always feel that that's the way it is for me. And I just have to admit that. It seems to me sometimes I get into temptations that I have a really hard time in. Sometimes I even succumb to them. I know you guys probably never succumb to your temptations, but I do. And so what do you think about the line, he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Fennels?
So, Phil, I think it's very important that we look for that way out. When we're being tempted by such, are we actually looking for an escape route, or are we so focused on the sin that's in front of us, that the situation that's presented itself to us, are we looking for that escape?
And I have to admit, I don't always look for that escape.
I don't think, well, I know I don't always, and I would probably assume that nobody always looks for it, but that's key and vital that we do look for that out for ourselves.
Well, and I also think that, lots of times I see things happen in other people's lives and I say, first off, thank God that wasn't set in front of me, because I don't think that I could have withstood it. And then I, go down the path of, well, maybe they're a much stronger person than I am. But I also think it goes back to the Lord's Prayer, where we ask every day for our daily bread. It's not what we need for tomorrow or next year or when the coronavirus is over. It's what do we need right now. And sometimes our abilities given on specific days are better than others. And some days we're better able to resist the temptation than we are on other days. So.
And it may have too, Susan, thinking about what you just said, is, as you know, my father-in-law just got out of the hospital from the coronavirus and pneumonia. So thank God for that. But I believe one of the reasons he was able to do that so quickly was that he was in magnificent shape. For he's 78 years old and still gets on his bike and rides 50 miles in an afternoon if he chooses to, and he works out. So I think by preparing ahead, he was able to overcome. And I think that may be a little bit of this too, is God's faithful, but he doesn't want us to run around unprepared all the time either. So I think that's part of staying in the Word, being around Christians, is becoming stronger, be prepared for these times. And then there are more ways out.
Phil, I think of Job and Job's situation as well, a little bit in this, and that God does allow a certain level of Satan to kind of go after him. And if you're real honest, at least the way I feel about Job sometimes, is that's an uncomfortable book, because the level at which Satan is allowed to go is a long way, and it's very hurtful. When you think about an entire family, children, losing, not just losing, you're thinking about it today, not just losing your business or something like that, but lose your entire family. very, very challenging. But there was a level that the Lord was saying, you don't go past this. And so there's something there going on that God knew what Job was able to handle and not succumb to some kind of a temptation. And so he knows us. Anyway, so.
Yeah, by the way, we'll be doing Job after we finish the New Testament. We'll start on the Old Testament, and then the Old Testament is going to start with Genesis and Job at the same time. So we're going to do Job inside of that, and we will continue that discussion of the uncomfortable parts of that. 1 Corinthians 10:31, which just summarizes it all. Paul could have probably just written this one particular verse and not had to deal with a whole bunch of other. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And that, I know that's one of the verses that the kids learn early on. It's a powerful verse for us that we can always lean back on that. It's a great rule of thumb. Then in 1 Corinthians 11:1, this is a scary verse for me. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I just don't think I very often want to get into front of people and say, oh, follow me, follow my example, because I'm following Christ. Just follow me. I just can't imagine how people get to that point. I feel so far away from that point that I think about Paul writing that and how he must have been so faithful over such a long period of time that he could write that and people would hear it and shake their heads. Yeah, I get it. Follow the example of Christ. Dave?
Bill, that he was saying, don't necessarily follow me, but notice my example is that I'm following Christ. Follow Christ like I'm following Christ.
Yeah. But that's pretty strong too. Would you want to tell people that all the time?
I probably wouldn't tell anybody anytime.
Yeah, that's a strong statement, and that was brought to my attention about a couple of years ago, and I see it. Paul writes that several times. I'm going, whoa, that is a strong thing. So I'm going to drop on down to 18. Where he says, in the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. So we've talked about how Paul despises division in the church and how he talks about it over and over. This is just one more time when he is talking about it, and part of this, the divisions are caused because they're taking communion is not good. So if you remember in the video, we talked about it, and you probably already know, back then their communion service was really a supper. When they had a meal together, and they took communion as part of that meal. And at least at this point in time in the Corinthian church, and probably in others, you can certainly get it from James that it may have been happening even in Jerusalem, that the rich people were bringing a lot of food and having a good old big party amongst themselves, while the poor people are starving to death and they really have nothing to eat. And so the way that they are participating in the Lord's Supper at that point was cause for division in the church, and he didn't like it. So when we read verse 27, we don't necessarily see that in the same light they did. So I hear I'll read verse 27. Whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. So I was taught growing up that meant when you have communion, you got to be quiet, you got to be thinking the right things, you got to be doing the right things. That's what it means to take that. And I think that's a part of it. I'm not going to say that's not part of it. I do think it is, but I think Paul had a bigger picture here. He's talking not just about the niceties of how you how you take communion, but the bigger picture, how you take the whole service together, how you meet as a church, how you get along as a church. That's determining whether you're taking it in a worthy or unworthy manner. It's a much bigger picture. And I think in our service maybe today, I can just imagine if, unfortunately I don't have this going on, but if I had something against one of the brothers or sisters at our church, how could I sit there and take communion in a worthy manner if we didn't resolve that? So there's a lot going on there. Fennell's raised their hands. Go ahead. Fennell,
Hey, Bill, do you know at what stage did the church start to provide communion itself for all of the members in the abbreviated fashion that we now have it? And if you don't know, you can look it up for us.
I don't know, and I just got through reading 2 books on church history, and I can't remember in either one of them where it addressed that. So I don't know the answer, and I don't even know where I'd go look it up. I would guess that the way you're talking about it, it would probably make more sense to think of it as the fact that the Catholic Church provided communion for its people, and then when the Protestants split off after Martin Luther King, they started having communion in a different way. So that I would guess for our purposes, it would be probably when the split is between the Protestants and the Catholics. I'm going to move on because we're running out of time. 1 Corinthians 12 is talking about spiritual gifts. We will spend time on spiritual gifts at some point in time, but the main point here that he's trying to get to is spiritual gifts have become a cause for division in the church, and that's what most of this chapter is about. Is not necessarily what spiritual gifts are. He's more talking about one spiritual gift is not more important than the other, and that they're all important together because that's how the church functions. And I think it is important. There's no way around it. It appears that in the Corinthian church there were lots of spiritual gifts, things that we wouldn't necessarily recognize today, but they clearly had them back then and talked about them. And we don't know what all Paul talks about because we don't have all his letters. But the one thing that is clear, as you get down in the latter part of this chapter, especially like verse 14, even so the body is not made up of one part, but of many. For their churches to function, they needed to have all of the spiritual gifts available to them. And apparently they had them all available. They just weren't valuing them as much. So now what are we talking about when we're spiritual gifts? So here are some of them. If you go down to verse 27, now you are the body of Christ and each one of you is a part of it. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, and of different kinds of tongues. So those are, I'm not sure that's a complete list of spiritual gifts, but at least it's a good list of spiritual gifts. Now, what all those mean at that point in time, my particular belief is that they're pretty clear what they were. I think different kinds of tongues means they were speaking in different kinds of tongues, not necessarily all languages that people knew, that as we would have seen on the day of Pentecost. I can't back that up as much as I would like to, but I don't feel that that's the purpose of the tongues at this point was different what it was on the day of Pentecost. So that's why I don't think there necessarily have to be known languages at that point. We do have evidence in the writings of Eusebius and some of the other people in as late as second, third century, there were still some churches who seemed to have spiritual gifts active in those churches. But for the most part, it doesn't look like they were. But I was thinking of one passage in Eusebius where he kind of points out, oh yeah, this church over here still practices this. And so I feel like at that point, as time goes along, the spiritual gifts have faded in significance. But I can't make the case like I've heard other people make that they all disappeared when the apostles died. I don't think history necessarily bears that out. And so I'll stop there, and we will, if people care, we will do a class on spiritual gifts someday. I'm not going to say when that is, but we can do it someday. And if people don't care, we won't. So we'll go there. So anything anybody wants to say? All right, then I will reiterate that on our Friday morning classes at 10:30 that we're going to have while the COVID virus is going on, and maybe after that, 10:30 on Fridays now, we're going to be doing the book Forgotten God by Francis Chan, and it's about the Holy Spirit. So we will be talking about some of these things as we go through that book, just in case anybody wants to know. So if you want to join on that class, everybody's welcome. Just get the book Forgotten God by Francis Chan. We'll do chapter 1 this coming Friday. So I'm going to stop there, throw it open to anybody who wants to say anything about anything, and then we'll end up the class there. We will have a 5 o'clock class today. If anybody wants to come back on or know anybody who wants to have it, it'll be the same class. And then we'll have 10:30 every morning and 8 o'clock every evening, every weekday morning and evening. So hang on a minute. Let me turn off recording.